single-handedly changed the debate on energy and the environment and the future of Canadian prosperity. And Vivian, on behalf of all Albertans, we are deeply grateful. Well, maybe not all Albertans, but probably at least 90% of them. Thank you so much, Perry, for this opportunity to talk about the future of this great province and what a more magnificent setting in which to do so. We all know, as Vivian just reminded us, that we are living through challenging times, the human costs of which are very real. And we can never forget that. Ultimately, when we fight for the future of this province's prosperity, we are fighting for ordinary women and men. And I want to start with that because I think we have sold ourselves short as a province. We need to recognize that in Canada's modern economic history, Alberta has been the great engine of social mobility and progress, measured by any index, any metric. Whether it's the lowest poverty rate in Canada, or by far the highest rate of Indigenous employment, or by far the highest level of entrepreneurship, people turning dreams into reality, or whether it's the level of employment of people with more modest levels of education. All through the developed world, we have seen huge segments of the population displaced by globalization and automation, by deep structural changes in the economy. Often people, good, hard-working people, honest folks in Rust Belt towns, in the American Midwest, in the Canadian industrial heartland, people who believed in the dream of endless opportunity, but have ended up often facing chronic unemployment, underemployment, and the despair that goes with the lack of work. In Alberta, the story has been different. We have been a place of unique opportunity for folks who face displacement, from the East Coast fishery to the Central Canadian traditional industries to the British Columbia forestry and elsewhere. People who elsewhere have been left out of the cycle of prosperity have instead enjoyed some of the best incomes and greatest opportunities available anywhere in the developed world, thanks to the ingenuity of this province and its energy industry. And so we have been that great engine of social progress. And so as we fight for this province, we are fighting for its modern role as that great elevator of social mobility and economic opportunity. But we are living through challenging times. There is no hiding it. And I want you to know that the government of Alberta has a broad, comprehensive, and detailed strategy to do everything we can to renew our economy, to get Alberta back to work. It involves, first of all, creating the optimal policy setting to restore investor confidence. Secondly, to do everything we can to achieve market access. We'll have to find a better phrase for that, to find access for our energy. And thirdly, to push back against the growing double standard being applied by capital markets to the Alberta energy industry under the guise of ESG, environmental and social and governance metrics. So let me speak about each of those, and then, because Perry asked me to talk about our fight for a fair deal, I'll give you an outline of what that constitutes. Firstly, restoring investor confidence with the optimal policy setting. We made a counterintuitive decision politically in the last election to put our fiscal weight on what we knew would be the tax cut that would create the most economic opportunity through our job creation tax cut that will reduce by 1/3 the tax rates in Canada. The next highest, Ontario, will be 45% higher than Alberta's, and we will be lower in our combined federal-provincial business tax rate than 44 of the 50 United States. Professor Jack Mintz estimates that this will help to create at least 55,000 new full-time private sector jobs. Professor Bev Dalby and his colleagues at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy and Faculty of Economics estimate that it will lead to the creation of 58,000 full-time private sector jobs and increase our GDP by over 2 points while increasing our per capita gross domestic product. Combined with that is the provincial adoption of new federal rules for the accelerated capital cost allowance or depreciation. Secondly, the passage of the Open for Business Act last spring, which restores the most favorable labour laws in Canada for the creation of new jobs. Thirdly, the carbon tax repeal. I know not everybody's in favour of that, although 2/3 of Albertans were. But that was the single largest tax cut in the province's history, removing a $1.8 billion deadweight cost on our economy that was doing precisely nothing measurable for the environment, but making life more expensive for everyone. Thirdly, our ambitious red tape reduction action plan to reduce by 1/3 the number of regulatory requirements imposed by the Alberta government in the next 4 years, with the support of a Red Tape Reduction Act, a minister, a designated secretariat within the government, and we are making progress, remarkable progress on that. Pause to say, and some of you heard me say this before, it is shocking that during the good years we got so complacent in this province that we allowed a constant accretion of regulatory complexity and slower moving approvals to the point where the CFIB ranked us as the worst province in Canada in terms of its job-killing red tape burden. Our goal is ultimately to become the freest and fastest moving economy in North America with respect to its regulatory environment. And if you think that's just some gauzy rhetoric, well, I hope that folks who've observed my intensity will see that we get things done. We are intense about getting that done. And part of that is retooling the Alberta Energy Regulator while maintaining obviously its independence as a high-quality regulator. We need common sense, outcome-based approach to regulations, and I can tell you we've already been piloting a new approvals process between the AER and Environment and Parks with remarkable, phenomenal outcomes. Too early to talk about those in detail, but very good news to come in this respect. Next, we have brought in the capacity for municipalities to offer competitive tax incentives for new capital investment, and just yesterday introduced new legislation to ensure that applies to machinery and equipment, because we know that we are competing with places like Texas and Louisiana when it comes to multi-billion-dollar, for example, petrochemical facilities, and we need to compete on a level playing field. Next, of course, restoring fiscal balance to the province, a difficult but necessary task to demonstrate to investors that because big deficits and debt represent future taxes and instability. And so we will be coming back to balance in a thoughtful way that prioritizes the most services and support for the most vulnerable over the next 4 years. Towards the end of our mandate, we will be appointing a tax reform panel to assess how we can apply the optimal tax policy to encourage growth and job creation in the future. And we might be tapping a couple of the people in this room to sit on that panel. And we've been fighting for our natural gas industry, which too often has been neglected by policymakers, with an associate minister for natural gas, an associate deputy minister tasked with implementing Hal Quisley's a panel on the future of our natural gas industry. This is involved in part retroactive property tax relief for dry gas wells and helping to champion sensible rules for the management of gas inventories during the summer and periods of maintenance, in particular on the NOVA system that has helped significantly increase Alberta gas prices to give our producers an opportunity while new markets come on board, petrochemicals, gas cogen, and hopefully liquefied natural gas. So those are just some of the things that we are doing in terms of an optimal policy setting. Secondly, market access, we all know, is the sine qua non of the future of our largest industry. And so we have been doing everything we can to increase the shipment of Alberta energy as production continues to increase without blowing out differentials. For folks who are frustrated with curtailment, I feel your pain. Believe me, I'm often accused by my opponents of being, quotes, a free market fundamentalist. So it was not an easy or normal thing for me to accept the necessity of curtailment caps on production. But I remind you folks, a year ago this week, we were dealing with $10 West Canada Select oil prices and a $50 differential. The taxpayers of Alberta were getting zero for their resource, and we were looking at a potential collapse of much of the industry with zero capital spending this year, and the human costs of that were intolerable. And that is why we supported curtailment as a temporary measure to restore some reasonable value to our largest export product. And we have continued to increase those caps sensibly, keeping an eye on inventories, on production, and on egress. And in fact, the current caps are now allow for higher production and shipment of energy than we had 14 months ago. So we are actually producing and shipping more Alberta crude than we ever have. And we have just recently announced special production allowances that allow incremental crude shipped by rail to be exempted from the production caps. We estimate that once CN is back up and running fully, that should add something like 250,000 additional barrels of shipments per day, about 550,000 altogether on rail, which is the current logistical maximum. We've just announced an exemption for incremental crude through new conventional production, new conventional drilling, to incentivize more activity in the service sector, and we believe that will be a lifeline much needed right now for the struggling Alberta service sector. Happily, Enbridge has announced that on December the 1st, in just a couple of days, they will be commissioning the Canadian portion of Line 3, which will add 100,000 barrels of egress. And of course, we hope for the commissioning of the full Line 3 replacement early in 2021, which represents an additional 380,000 barrels. Deblocking and optimization of pipelines by Enbridge and a number of other pipeline companies could add as much as 400,000 additional barrels of egress and on top of Line 3. So altogether, why do I go through that? For those not in the energy industry, it might be too technical. I go through it because it's important for us to understand, as I've said to investors on Wall Street and in Houston, that there is a path forward. Within the next year or 15 months, we will be shipping several hundred, perhaps 800,000 additional barrels of Alberta energy, and there is a future for the midterm until we get, hopefully, to the completion of TMX or KXL. And let me tell you that in my discussions with the Prime Minister, and more recently my nearly 3-hour conversation with the new Deputy Prime Minister, Alberta-born Chrystia Freeland, that I believe the federal government is truly committed to its completion. And of course, this is the number one demand of Alberta in our fight for fairness. We demand guarantees that the federal government will do this on a timeline and will ensure the rule of law is applied to any civil disobedience that seeks to block the most reviewed and regulated pipeline probably in all of human history. And we continue to be hopeful about Keystone XL, and indeed, we will do what we can, working with the industry for a path for the future. Now, a critical part of all of this, of course, as Vivian said, the big game changer is Aboriginal participation. And more than that, co-ownership of projects such as many of these. And that is why perhaps the boldest initiative of our government has been the creation of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, backstopped by $1 billion of the faith and credit of the government of Alberta. I think there has been a real transformation in understanding in recent years. As we've seen, we have Joel Dion here, for example, as we've seen great leaders like him see the resource industry as an opportunity to move Indigenous people from poverty to prosperity. At the same time, we've seen a growing number of leaders in our energy industry understand that we have a moral obligation to make that happen. And so too does the Crown. And that is why we have launched the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. The legislation has been passed. The board will be appointed in the days to come. And we believe this really will be a game changer. We believe if this model works in facilitating Aboriginal co-ownership of major resource projects, that it can be expanded. We would be prepared to expand it here in Alberta. I've talked to other provinces who are interested in the model and to the federal government because this represents both an economic imperative and a moral obligation. Thirdly, we must deal with a growing challenge to access to capital, both debt and equity, to our largest industry, posed by the hypocritical distorted and inconsistent application of environmental, social, and governance metrics to investment decisions, much of this emanating from Europe. As Vivian just said, we are 15 years behind the curve when it comes to upping our game and defending an industry that has done so much to fuel social progress across Canada and around the world as the most responsible major producer of energy. And that is very true on the question of ESG. I'll confess, this is an acronym I don't think I heard until earlier this year. I was talking to a major industry leader in Houston. He said pretty much the same thing. And yet, the seeds were planted many years ago. That has resulted in a growing number of European financial institutions zeroing out effectively Alberta by throwing the oil sands under the bus, while every one of those the same financial institutions continues to backstop and provide financial services, credit and equity in the Russian and OPEC and energy countries. This is outrageous that they would deign, to hold this liberal democracy with the highest human rights, environmental, and labor standards on earth to an impossible standard, while they continue to backstop energy producers that have effectively no real environmental standards, that often treat women like property instead of people, that have some of the worst human rights records on earth, and that in some cases spread violence, terror, conflict, and warfare around the world. So as I said the night I was elected as Premier, if companies like HSBC boycott Alberta, we will boycott them. And I mean it. Now, that has got the attention of some of these companies. That has got the attention of some of these companies, and we've now entered into a dialogue with a number of them. And we have also engaged some of the world's leading experts on ESG to help us assemble the most relevant, up-to-date, verifiable, objective data on the growing on the increasing environmental performance of Alberta's energy sector. The fact, for example, that we have reduced carbon intensity from the oil sands by about 30% since the year 2000, and that we are credibly on track for a further reduction of 20%. And you know all the technologies that are coming on stream that will make an enormous difference. But we refuse to allow the ESG metrics to be focused exclusively on just one part of the E, CO2, and not the other parts of the E, conservation, and forestry preservation, water and air quality, and all of the other issues. And we absolutely refuse to allow them to get away by pitching this to their shareholders without talking honestly about the social impact of energy development in different jurisdictions. Now, we need your help. Our government has established a working group that is co-chaired by David Knight-Legg from my office, who is here, and I believe Mark Cameron, our Deputy Minister for Policy Coordination and Executive Council as well. David, on my behalf, has been meeting with key investors in Europe. He just got back from 2 days of meetings on Bay Street in Toronto, bringing our tough love message, our objective data, but also our insistence on fair and equitable treatment in the application of ESG principles. Part of this is also continuing, of course, the story of innovation. And that is why our government has launched our Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Program, the TIER Fund, supported by a levy on major industrial emissions that is applied in a very intelligent way that will get us to a significant reduction in CO2 emissions from Alberta with less economic cost than was the case under the previous government's program, and will be a fund available to support the further scaling up of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, carbon sequestration, that can also help with enhanced oil recovery, of course, gas cogeneration, and so much more. But this, as you know, and as Vivian just intimated, the single greatest way that we could reduce global GHG emissions would be to massively expand Canadian shipments of liquefied natural gas to the developing world to help them convert from coal to gas electricity production. And that is a central issue on our demand for fair treatment with the federal government. We need the federal government to see the vision of Canada being a global leader in the climate challenge by helping the world reduce its emissions on a massive scale. If we were to ship adequate volumes of LNG to places like China and India, the offset in CO2 output would be greater than the entire annual greenhouse gas emissions of the Canadian economy. This, too, must be a game changer, and we must have federal buy-in to that vision. Now, Perry, I know we're running behind time, but let me then just talk about...
No, you just go right ahead.
All right. You asked me to talk about the fight for a fair deal. I don't need to tell you folks how frustrated Albertans feel. A recent poll indicated 1/3 support for separation from the Canadian Federation. Now, obviously, some of those people are using that opinion, the polling opportunity to blow off steam, to express the depth of their frustration. But the number that we should really be watching is the bigger number. In the same and similar polls, upwards of 80% of Albertans say that they understand or sympathize with that separatist sentiment. 80% is pretty much as close as you get to unanimity in a complex democracy. And so we say to our friends in the rest of Canada, please do not make the mistake of deriding or dismissing this deep frustration that is felt very broadly across the partisan, social, regional, political spectrum in this province. It must be taken seriously. And the worst thing that leadership could do would be to deride, dismiss, and marginalize those voices and those concerns. So we must listen to Albertans. We must give them an opportunity to express their heartfelt frustration and to offer their ideas on how we can secure a fair deal in the Canadian Federation. You know, and I have to say this every time, and I should say it every time, that I am and always will be a patriotic Canadian. And I believe the vast majority of Albertans in their hearts are Canadian patriots. We have a higher than average representation in the Canadian Armed Forces. We are attached to the symbols and the values of this country. And we do not begrudge our fellow Canadians the generosity that we have shared with them, the $600 billion net fiscal contribution that we have made since 1960, the $23 billion annual net fiscal contribution that we have made over the past 5 years, the $200+ billion net contribution that we've made in the past decade alone. We do not begrudge our fellow Canadians the generosity that we have shared. We are proud to have done so. And you know one of the remarkable things about this? You know, some of the chattering classes of the Laurentian elites who mock and deride the adversity through which Albertans are currently going and the political frustration that is the result of it. You know, I remind them that the population of this province has doubled in the past 3 decades, thanks primarily to Canadians from all across the country joining us in this great enterprise of creating an opportunity society, in part through an innovation-driven energy sector. It is in part those unemployed fishery workers from Newfoundland and Labrador. C'est en partie ces gens qui faisaient face au chômage au Québec, qui ont déménagé en Alberta, qui sont devenus les Albertains fiers. It's in part folks from every corner of the country who joined us here. And they too are expressing these views. They came from parts of the country that benefited from Alberta's responsible resource development. And here's the interesting thing. The frustration, I would argue, is deeper and broader today than it was in 1980 when this was a much different, more homogeneous and rural province than it is today, a much more urban and diverse province. So these are Canadians, proud Canadians, who are saying, Yes, we're happy to share much of our resources, but please allow us to develop those resources, to ship them to global markets, to get a fair price for them. Please respect what we do so well. Please see the Alberta energy industry as Canada's energy industry, as Canada's greatest asset, as Canada's greatest opportunity for future prosperity. And all we ask for is not a special deal, but a fair deal. And to get that fair deal, I believe we must seek every possible way to maximize our leverage in the Federation. And that is, let me tell you how we've begun doing so through actions taken by our government, and then additional strategies we'll be pursuing. First of all, within an hour of becoming a government, we proclaimed into law Bill 12, the Preserving Canada's Economic Prosperity Act, what some have called the turn off the taps legislation, to demonstrate that we are prepared, like Peter Lougheed was 35 years ago, to protect the value of our resources if other provinces seek to block them. Secondly, we immediately made an impassioned appeal to the Senate of Canada on Bill C-48, and I believe that had an impact, the Senate Transportation Committee voting to delete the entire tanker ban, which for the first time in the history of the Federation seeks to block only one product coming from only one province, Alberta bitumen, and we believe for that reason is unconstitutional. Unfortunately, it was later reverted at the House of Commons. We made an impassioned plea to the Senate to rewrite or stop Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines law that creates an impossibly challenging new environmental assessment regime. And miracle of miracles, the Senate of Canada, including the majority of Liberal senators and independents appointed by Mr. Trudeau, effectively rewrote the bill with 189 amendments, including every one tabled by the Government of Alberta, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association. Again, sadly, that was reverted, and that is on our the top of our list of demands for the fair deal. We secured support from every province, save one, for the concept of energy and resource corridors, including oil and gas pipelines. And the only caveat was Quebec on oil, but they have clearly demonstrated their support for being partners in LNG exports. We established the Indigenous Legal Defence Fund that will provide funding for First Nations to go to court to assert their right to economic development and to create a level playing field, because many of the groups that Vivian talked about have been fronting a small minority of anti-development First Nations to carry their agenda, their anti-development agenda on behalf of U.S. billionaires in our courts, while many impoverished Canadian First Nations have had no voice share in the legal and political fight over responsible resource development. That changes with the Indigenous Legal Defence Fund. We've launched the public inquiry under the Inquiry Acts into the foreign sources of funds, picking up on Vivian's research, but also the research of the U.S. Congressional Committee, which concluded last year that there's compelling evidence of Russian government activity supporting opposition to pipelines and shale development in North America. I can tell you that when I was the Minister of National Defense, the Secretary General of NATO told me point blank that there was zero doubt in his mind, based on NATO intelligence, that the Russian government had been involved in funding Western European environmental organizations to oppose fracking and shale developments in that continent. So why should we believe that they stopped at the Atlantic when it came to preserving their vast energy markets? And that is in part for why we have launched that public inquiry. We are challenging the constitutionality of the federal carbon tax, because we really do believe it is an invasion of our jurisdiction, and we offer the TIER program as a credible alternative that deals with the climate challenge. We have passed back into law the Senate Election Act, and will hold elections for senators in October of 2021, another way of asserting a stronger voice in the Federation. We have created, with a $30 million budget, the Canadian Energy Centre to respond in real time to the lies and myths told about our energy sector, really stepping up our game. We have, as I mentioned, created the $1 billion Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. We hosted the Stampede Premiers meeting, which demonstrated that a majority of premiers representing 2/3 of the population agree with our fight for fairness and market access. And we will be reiterating those messages at the urgent Council of the Federation meeting in Toronto on Sunday night and next Monday. We've pressed the federal government, and I did this directly with the Prime Minister, to give Alberta an exemption from the Canada Housing Mortgage Corporation stress test that was designed to deal with overheated real estate markets in Toronto and Vancouver, but is sideswiping an industry here in Alberta that is struggling and making the dream of home ownership more remote for Albertans. So those are some of the things that we have done. Now, we have now to go further in our fight, in our developing leverage and asserting our province. You know what? 4.5 million people. We are projected to exceed British Columbia in population within the next 5 years, be the third largest population in the province. And until 4 years ago, we had the second largest GDP in the country. It's time for us to act like the major province that we are and to assert ourselves and our constitutional jurisdiction. Now, we have appointed the Fair Deal panel made up of a group of eminent Albertans, including the chair, Aricia Lenny, who worked with Peter Lougheed at Intergovernmental Relations in the 1980s and who most recently was Deputy Minister of Western Economic Diversification. My good friend Jason Goodstriker, former councillor of the the Kenney Reserve, as well as former AFN Regional Chief. Donna Kennedy-Glanz, former minister, Stephen Lougheed, Preston Manning, and 3 members of our caucus to ensure that they're connected to government. They will be listening to Albertans over the next 2 months and coming back to us with a report. We've asked them, in particular, to focus on the possibility of establishing a provincial revenue agency to collect provincial taxes directly by ending the Canada-Alberta Tax Collection Agreement while joining Quebec in seeking an agreement to collect federal taxes within the province. Secondly, to review the feasibility of creating an Alberta pension plan by withdrawing from the Canada Pension Plan. And let me just say that we would not actually make that change without the consent of Albertans as expressed in a referendum. But I think there is a very compelling case to be made. It may be the easiest way for us to reduce the net fiscal transfer to the rest of the Federation. Given our young population, we are making about a $3 billion net contribution, and it would allow us to lower premiums, to create jobs, and to create a competitive advantage. It would also allow us to further expand AIMCO, that would be the asset manager, into a world-class and world-scale fund that would begin at that point, could potentially have $185 billion of assets under management, approaching the size of the Caisse de dépôt of Quebec. We will review establishing a provincial police force by ending the Alberta Police Service Agreement with the Government of Canada. I think a lot of urban Albertans don't understand that one, but I would remind them they are policed by municipal services, and in rural Alberta there's growing frustration with the current arrangements. We would emulate Quebec's practice of playing a larger role in international relations, in part by seeking Alberta representation in treaty negotiations that affect our interests. We would also emulate Quebec's legal requirement that public bodies, including municipalities and school boards, seek provincial approval before they enter into agreements with the Government of Canada. We would opt out of the federal cost-share program, seeking full compensation like Quebec, such as the federal government's proposed pharmacare program, and seek an exchange of tax points for federal cash transfers under the Canada Health and Social Transfers to operate those programs more according to the priorities of Albertans. I could go on, but I know I'm blowing the lunch schedule here, so I will wrap up. And we're going to be taking questions, right, Perry, during lunch? What's that?
Anytime you like.
Okay. Sorry about that. We're busy. And I actually, there's a lot of content I haven't mentioned. But yeah, hopefully you get the point, which is this. Albertans are proud Canadians. We are proud to have been a major engine of prosperity and shared generosity across the Federation. We want to continue playing that role. We believe, with the massive steps being taken on environmental improvement in our energy sector, being, as Vivian points out, the only major source of energy that is a rights-respecting liberal democracy. We believe that when that last barrel of hydrocarbon energy is bought, it should come from Alberta. The International Energy Agency projects growing global demand for oil and gas through at least the year 2040, a doubling, by the way, of gas consumption, and a 10% increase in oil. But even their most bearish scenario projects a reduction of only 20% in global oil demand between now and 2040 to 80 million barrels a day from 100 million a day. And as you know, we see throughout the world a declining accessible conventional reserves. While we're sitting on 179 billion barrels of proven and probable reserves in a country that is the envy of the world, which by 2040 will, I believe, be producing that at well below 2040, will be well below the global average CO2 and GHG emissions for energy. So we have an amazing story to tell, being supported by policy and now I think by vigorous government leadership. Let us tell that story, and let those Albertans who are challenged, who are living through a time of adversity, know, yes, we've got a lot more tough times to go through in many areas, but hope is on the horizon. We're projected to have the strongest economic growth in Canada in the next 2 years. These policies will begin to yield dividends, and working in partnership with the great entrepreneurs who have made Alberta the engine of Canadian prosperity, I believe that our best days lie ahead. Thank you very much.